Hi everyone, welcome to Data Labs. I am your host and host Madhur. In this video, I will be explaining to you about the constraints in SQL and auto-increment. If you are new to SQL, please go through my video SQL Basics. The link to the video is there in the description below. Let's start. I had already opened the SQL Server Management Studio. Let's go to our database, Data Labs demo. Let's create a new query. Because we created the new query from Data Labs demo, the Data Labs demo database is already selected. So we won't write the query use database Data Labs demo, that's not needed now. Let's straight away jump into understanding the constraints with the help of some examples. Let's start with not null constraint. The column on which we apply the not null constraint cannot hold any null values in it. Even if we try to add any values, it will throw some error. Let's try creating a table with some not null columns. So we will create a table employee with two columns, employee name with not null constraint and address without any constraint. Let's create the table. Okay, so we are creating the table employee with column employee name and address. Employee name has the data type varchar 50 and a constraint not null. This is how we apply the constraint not null, by adding the keyword not null after the data type. Firstly, let's create the table. Table created successfully. Let's go into the Data Labs demo, tables, refresh it. Okay, our DBO employee table have been created. Let's expand the table. Let's see the columns. Okay, the employee name is not null and the address can have some nulls. Now let's insert some data into this table and see how does the not null works. I'm adding Madhur as the employee name and address as 5 ABC Road XYZ City. Let me insert this, execute. The data got inserted successfully. Let's add the select star from employee and see the data. Okay, the data have got inserted successfully over here if you see. Now let's insert another record with null address. I'll just change the name to Madhur1. Remove the address. Let's execute. This gives an error that the column names and the number of supplied values does not match. Because we supplied the value for only one column, so we need to specify over here that for which column the value is being specified. If we don't specify the column names explicitly, that means that the values are for all the columns. So it gave a mismatch over here. Let me mention the column name. Okay, now let's insert it. One row affected, column inserted successfully. Let's select star from employee. The null got inserted successfully into the second record as there is no not null constraint over here. Now let's do vice versa. Let's insert only the address and no employee name. So the column name would be address and the column value I'll just put something like this. Should give us some error that employee name should not be null. Execute. Okay, the error says that cannot insert the value null into the column employee name and also mentions the table name. Column does not allow nulls, insert fails. So this is the error we got. So we cannot insert any nulls into this column, and that is because of the not null constraint. I hope with this it is clear that what is a not null constraint. Let me drop this table now. Now let's understand the unique constraint. For that I will open a new query. The column with unique constraint cannot have any duplicate values in it, but yes, it can have some null values. Let's try understanding it with an example. We will create a table employee with three columns this time: employee name, email address, and address. So we are creating the table employee with column employee name, email and address. Employee name has the constraint not null and email has the constraint unique, and address is without any constraint again. Let's create the table, execute. Let's refresh this. Let's expand the table employee, see the columns over here. Okay, the columns are employee name, email and address. If you see, email can be null. If you go to the keys, there's a unique key constraint applied. Now let's try to test the unique key constraint by inserting some records. If you see over here, I'm not adding any column names over here explicitly, as I'm inserting the values for all the columns over here. So there is no need to explicitly mention the column names. Let's insert. Okay, the record got inserted successfully. Let's try to insert another record without any email address. We will have to mention the column names over here now. Now let's try to insert this. Execute. The data got inserted successfully. Let's try to fetch the data. Execute. Okay, so we can see both the records inserted. We have duplicates over here in employee name because there was no unique constraint over here, and email can be null as well, so it took null. Now let's try to duplicate the email over here and see what result does it give. Okay, I'll put the name Madhur1. I will put the same email address. I have to specify the column name also over here. Execute it now. Okay, the violation of unique key constraint is giving us an error. Cannot insert duplicate key in object DBO employee. So this example shows us that how unique constraint works. Let's drop the table again. Refresh. Now we will create another query to understand the primary key constraint. Primary key. The column with the primary key should have no duplicates and null values. This is the most essential constraint as it uniquely identifies each record. Primary key can be a single column or a set of columns as well. Let's create the table employee with columns employee ID, employee name, email and address. Here employee ID will be the primary key as every employee has an ID and it will be always unique for each employee, hence identifying each employee as well. Let's create the table. Let's create the table. I'll just copy the script from the previous query. We'll just add the column employee ID over here. Let's create the table employee once again with the primary key. Command completed successfully and table created. Let's refresh this. Employee table created. Let's go to the columns. If you see, there is a key added in front of the employee ID column over here and it's mentioned as pk int and it cannot be null, not null. Let's go to the keys. There are two keys added over here. One is the unique key and one is the primary key. And there is any ID added to it. If we want, we can give our own name to the primary key as well. Now let's insert some data into this table. Let's insert it, execute, one row inserted. Okay, record inserted successfully. Now let's insert another record, this time with a duplicate value for employee ID. Here only the employee ID is same, rest all is different. Let's insert it, execute. Here is the violation of primary key constraint. Cannot insert duplicate key into the object dbo employee. The duplicate key value is 101. Okay, so we can't insert a duplicate value and we can't even insert a null. Let's try doing that. We'll have to mention the column names over here. Let's fire this. It gives an error that cannot insert the value null into the column employee ID. I hope that explains a single column primary key. Let's drop the table. In this example, I explained to you the single column primary key. Let's create a table employee with the composite primary key, that is the primary key on multiple columns. We will create a table employee with columns employee ID, organization, employee name, email, and address. Employee ID can be same in multiple organizations. So let's try to store this data with organization name as well. So a combination of employee ID and the organization will uniquely identify each employee. Let's create the table. Now let's create the table employee once again. We will not specify the primary key over here. We will just specify the column names over here. We will specify the primary key at last by using the constraint keyword and the name of the primary key. Then in bracket, we need to specify the columns. So I will specify employee ID and organization name. So this way we can also give the name to the primary key and also create the composite primary key. This way of declaring the constraint can be used for other constraints as well. Now let's create the table. Execute, command completed successfully. Let's go to the tables, refresh. DBO employee is created. Let's go to the columns. Now it shows the primary key on two columns, employee ID and organization name, and both are PK, primary key, and both are not null. If you go to the keys, the primary key is created with the name PK employee. Now let's insert some data into this table again. So I've added the company name XYZ over here. I'll just execute the query. Okay, the data got inserted successfully. Let's do a select star from employee. Okay, now we have the employee ID 101, organization XYZ, employee name Madhur, and the details. Now let's try to add a record with the same employee ID but a different organization name. Let's insert this. Okay, this is the violation of unique key, actually not the primary key. So I'll have to change this over here. Okay, let's insert it again. Okay, record got inserted successfully. Select star from employee. Okay, the same employee ID exists over here, but different organization names. So the composite primary key and all is different. So that is what is uniquely identifying this record and makes it a primary key. I hope with this the composite primary key should also be clear to you all. Let's drop this table again. Now let's take a scenario that we created the table but forgot to add the primary keys. And then we alter the table to add the primary keys. So let's see how we can alter a table to add the primary keys or any other constraint. We'll create the same table once again, this time without the constraint. One thing which we need to remember is we have to specify the columns as not null, as the null columns can't be altered to a primary key. Okay, we added this. Okay, let's refresh. Employee columns. Okay, there is no primary key on these columns for now. Let's alter the table to add the primary key. Alter table command is alter table, then the table name. We are going to add the constraint for primary key, so it would be add, then the constraint along with the constraint details. So this way we can add other constraints as well, but here we are adding the primary key constraint. So let's alter the table to add the primary key constraint. Execute, command completed successfully. Let's refresh. Okay, the primary key have been created now. The name of the primary key is again pk employee, and it's applied on both the columns employee ID and organization name. So that's how we alter a table to add a constraint, and this time we added the constraint primary key, but similarly we can add other constraints as well. Now let's drop the table again. Now let's create a new query. Now let's see what is default constraint with an example. Now when a default constraint is applied on a table, if the value for that column is left null, then a default value is added into that column. Now let's create the table employee with columns employee ID, employee name, email, address, and age, where we will apply a default constraint on age, which if left null will be 18. Let's create the table. Copy the query from here. So here we are creating the column age, which has data type int, constraint default, and the default value is 18. Let's create this table now. Execute, command completed successfully, table created. Refresh. Okay, there is a primary key on employee ID, and there are primary keys and unique keys over here. And there is a default constraint on age added over here in the constraints section. Now let's insert some data into this table. Let's insert into employee table some values and age 30. Let's insert this record. Okay, the data got inserted successfully. Let's read the data by select star from employee. Okay, the data got inserted successfully. Now let's deliberately miss the value for address and see what happens, and then we will deliberately miss the value for age. Let's fire this query and see what happens when there is no default constraint applied. Okay, the data got inserted successfully. Let's see the data, select star from employee. Okay, there was no default constraint on address, so it remains null. Now let's try the null on column age. Now let's fire this query which has no entry for the column age. Execute, record inserted successfully. Now let's read the data. Now if you see for this record where employee ID is 103, the default age is 18. We didn't add anything over here, but the default constraint added the age as 18. So this was the default constraint. Let's draw this table. Now let's understand the check constraint with an example. We'll open a new query. Check constraint is applied with the check condition. The column on which the check constraint is applied checks that the value should not violate the check condition. Let's understand that with an example. Let's again create the table employee with columns employee ID, employee name, email, address, age, and salary. There is a minimum salary for each employee. The salary cannot be less than 10,000. So we will apply the check constraint on the salary with the condition that salary cannot be less than 10,000. Let's create the table. I'll again copy the script from the previous query. So this way we are applying the check constraint on the salary column where the salary can only be greater than 10,000. Let's create the table, execute, command completed successfully. Let's refresh the table. Okay, the TVO employee is created. The columns, there is a primary key on employee ID. Here are the keys and the constraints, check constraint and the default constraint. Now let's try to insert some data into this table. So here we are trying to insert the salary of 12,000, which is greater than 10,000. So it will get inserted successfully. Now let's insert another record which will be violating this constraint. Salary of 9,000 only. Now let's try to insert this record with the salary of 9,000. Now we see the error over here. The insert statement conflicted with the check constraint CK employee salary. We violated the constraint and we saw an error over here. I hope with that the check constraint should be clear to you that why and how do we add a check constraint. Let's drop the table again. Let's refresh the tables. The employee table have been deleted. Let's create a new query. And lastly, let's understand what is the foreign key constraint. Okay, the foreign key constraint checks if the column have only reference table values. So let's take an example. We have two tables, employee and department. In employee table, we have a column department. The column department should have same values of department as which are present in the department table. This relationship between the two tables is established by the foreign key constraint. Foreign key can be created only on the primary key columns of the table which is being referred. Let's understand that with example. We will create two tables, employee and department. Employee table will have columns employee ID, employee name, email, address, age, salary, and department. And the department table will have the columns department and the number of employees in that department. Let's create the table. Copy the query from here. Let's also create the table department. Here we are creating a table department in which department is the primary key and we have another column total employees. Department column will be the one which we will be referencing in the table employee. To refer to the department column, we will create a foreign key on column department in table employee. So let's create the column department. Okay, so this is a syntax to create the foreign key in which the foreign key references. This is the table name and this is the column name. It is showing an error over here that the foreign key references invalid table department because the department table have not yet been created. So let's create this first. We will firstly create the table department. Execute the table department created successfully. Now when we'll create the table employee, that's created successfully as well. Now let's see the tables. Let's refresh. So we have two tables created, department and employee. The department table had the primary key department and the employee table had the primary key employee ID. But if you see, there is another FK which is the foreign key created on the column department. If we go to the constraints, we have check constraint and the default constraint. There are three keys over here now: primary key, foreign key, and the unique key. Now let's firstly try to insert the data to the department table. So we will insert three records in table department with department as HR, finance, and IT. Let's insert it. Okay, the data got inserted successfully. Let's read the data. Let's start from department. Execute. Okay, we are able to see the data for department now. Now let's insert the data into the employee table and see how the foreign key works. Let's insert the first record which follows the primary key. The department is IT. Let's insert this record. One row affected, the data got inserted successfully. Now let's insert another record which violates the foreign key. I'll put the department as facilities. Let's fire this query, execute. Okay, the insert statement conflicted with the foreign key constraint and the insert was forbidden. So we could not insert this data because the foreign key was violated. The foreign key not only helps us to put the constraint, but it also helps us to maintain the relationship between different tables. And that's what the foreign keys are. I hope with this all the constraints should be clear to you. Not null, unique constraint, primary key constraint, default constraint, check constraint, and the foreign key constraint. Let's drop the tables. Let's see what happens when we drop the table department. It cannot drop the table department because it is referred by another foreign key. Firstly, we will have to drop the table employee, which is referencing the table department, and then we will drop the table department. So drop execute depart employee table dropped successfully. And then execute and department table also dropped successfully. Now let's open new query and we'll understand the auto increment. So auto increment is a feature that allows a column to automatically generate a new value for itself whenever a new record is added. So even if we don't add a value, it will generate a new value considering the previous value. Like if the previous value was 1 and you want to increment by 1, so the next value will be 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, and then 6. The auto increment is often used on the primary keys so that they don't repeat and get incremented every time a new record is inserted. The auto increment on SQL Server is applied using the keyword identity, and then in the parentheses you need to specify which will be the start value and then what will be the increment value. Now let's understand that with an example. So let's try creating an employee table with auto increment on employee ID. Let's create this table. Employee ID, which is an integer, let me put an identity over here starting from 100 and incrementing by 1. Let's create this table. So employee table created successfully. Let's go to the tables, refresh, expand the tables. Okay, the table employee created successfully and there is a primary key on employee. Just remember, auto increment is not a constraint, it is just a feature which increments the value. Let's try inserting the data into this table. Now let's see what happens. Okay, we could not insert the data because we are trying to set the value 101 for the column employee ID. We will skip the value for employee ID and insert the record with the other values. Let's execute. Okay, the record got inserted successfully. Let's review the data. Employee, execute, and the data got inserted successfully. The first record which got inserted was with the employee ID 100. Now the next record which will get inserted would be 101. Now let's try inserting that. Let's insert this record. Let's select star from employee. So we didn't add an employee ID. It automatically picked up the previous employee ID and incremented it by 1 and added 101. Now if we keep adding the values, it will keep incrementing it by 1. I hope with that it should be clear to you that what is an auto increment and how do we implement on SQL Server using the identity columns. We'll again drop the table employee. Let's refresh. Table dropped and we're done. And that's the end of this tutorial. I hope it was useful for you. Please like and subscribe the channel. It motivates us to bring more such content for you. I will be coming up with more SQL tutorials. Stay tuned. For any suggestions, questions, or any explicit topics which you want to be covered, you can drop a comment in the comment box. See you next time.